Hello everybody, I'm George from Ireland, so welcome back to my English Law channel. So carrying on with a bit more about registered title and looking at interests which are registrable and when they'll be binding on the purchaser of registered land. So much of this is arising from the 2002 Land Registration Act. It's important to say the year because of course the 1925 iteration of that act was decidedly different. So it's a series of binary questions you need to go through. First of all, has the land been registered or not? So is the interest registrable or not? If it's yes, we have to ask, has it been registered? If it has been registered, it's binding. If it has not been registered, we have to say, has it been protected by notice? And it's quite a complicated issue. Is it actual notice, imputed notice, constructive notice? But if in the end we decide it has been protected by notice after a disclosure, after some reasonably careful inspections of the land, if you ask someone who's capable of declaring it to you and he or she answers you truthfully, if they lie, they can't benefit from the lie. But anyway, if we decide it has been protected by notice, then yes, it's binding. If it's not been protected by notice, is it an interest that overrides? And if it is, then it's still binding. That's pretty unusual. Okay, but if it's not an interest that overrides, then we ask, is it a registrable disposition made for a valuable consideration under the LRA 2002? That's per sections 29 and 132. And if the answer is yes, it's not binding. If the answer is no, then the interest is binding. But let's go back to, is the interest registrable? And if the answer was no, we have to ask, is it protected by notice? So is it protectable by notice? And if it is protectable by notice, we have to ask, has it been protected by notice? In which case, we go through those steps I adumbrated a moment earlier. If the answer is no, it's not been it's not protectable by notice, is it overreachable? And if the answer is no, we ask, is it an overriding interest? And we've already been through whether it's an overriding interest or not. If the answer is yes, it is overreachable, we have to ask, has it been overreached? If the answer is no, again we go back to, is it an overriding interest? Asking, has it been overreached? If the answer is yes, then it is not binding. Well, if it sounds like it's sort of nebulous and incredibly confusing, then then it is. Okay, it's kaleidoscopically complicated. The trickiest part of law that I've ever encountered. All right, we need to look a little bit about settlements, trusts of land, and trusts of sale. So it's not settlement in the ordinary sense of the word. So what is the aim of a settlement? And that's to create a series of beneficial interests in favour of a group of people, one after the other. It might well be multi-generational. So the settler wishes to transfer his land to Arabella for life, and then to Belinda in fee simple. This is a settlement, and it can go on through many more people than that. It can go on to persons as yet unconceived. So in history, settlements were used by very affluent families, by the baronial class, to make sure the land stayed in their hands for centuries and not be split up. In 1925, there were a number of reforms to try and stop these very long-term settlements. This included limiting how long they could run, so no more perpetuities, they can't be forever, and a very heavy taxation on them, the Settled Land Act, 1925. And that brought in some very tricky and expensive rules to run these strict settlements. And that's a type of settlement which creates consecutive interests in land. So since 1925, all these settlements, these strict settlements, need to be in a trust. So as I've shown, the strict settlements are very problematic for everyone involved, and usually they were replaced by trust for sale. But the trouble is, strict settlements can no longer be created. Well, there's only one form of settlement. The term strict settlement sometimes describes a list of successive interests in land for one person after another, often through the same family. Up until 1997, trust for sale operated whenever there were concurrent interests that were set up in land. For example, a couple living together, whether married or not, or where the term was a trust of sale came from. But this was applied to a settlement creating consecutive interests. So it was obvious that trust for sale wasn't an apposite way to deal with these family arrangements, which had set up beneficial interest in land, because then you'd assume that the trustees have to actually sell the land, and at most they could delay the sale. But the family seldom sees land as solely something which is of financial value. It's got sentimental value, and also it's a place to live. So the major change came in 1997 when the Trust of Land and Appointment of Trustees Act took effect. So previously, a settlement of land was created either through a strict settlement or where the purchaser took his title from a tenant for life under the Settled Land Act 1925, or indeed a trust for sale, if he took it from the trustees for sale. But these days, all these are trusts of land as per sections 2 and 4 and 5 of the Trust of Land and Appointment of Trustees Act, TOLATA. So under the SLA 1925, settlements are not impacted by this, and they're still governed by those very tricky rules, which I'll come on to later. But no new SLA settlements can be created since 1997. So strict settlements are less important than they used to be. There are not so many of them around. Anyway, so we need to look really at trust of sale, sorry, trust of land, which is sort of a new version of trust for sale. Trusts for sale still exist. They are occasionally created, but much more commonly trusts of land are created now. There's a subtle distinction. So anyway, so the trust for sale was there. Anyway, we look at the trust of land, and that's a bit more modern and more common, and often there's a co-ownership situation there. So trust for sale were helpful in interpreting the rules, and that will lead into trusts of sale, which is the new instrument. So we'll look into 3 different kinds of ownership of land and see how important they are. So trust of land I'll come to more in greater profundity, and they're often about co-ownership, as I said. So there's a major difference between a settlement of land, where 2 or more people have successive interests in the same parcel of land, and they're usually under a trust of land. There's co-ownership when 2 or more people have concurrent interests, that's at the same time, in the same bit of land, and that's usually under a trust of land. So we have the same mechanism which is applicable to both. However, they're quite different in nature. So let's look into some of the machinery. Under Section 1.1 of the Settled Land Act 1925, a settlement was an instrument under which the land is limited in trust for people by way of succession, for a baby possibly, for an estate in fee simple, or for a term of years absolute. So that meant whenever successive interested land were set up, a strict settlement was created. So to Arabella for life, and then to Belinda absolutely, or to Arabella for life, and the remainder to Belinda for life, and then to Charlotte absolutely, for example. However, post the 1925, there's a Settled Land Act. It set up 2 different stages. Number 1, there's a vesting deed, and that vests the legal fee simple in the tenant for life. It says what the property is, what the dimensions of it is, where it is, and it says who the trustees are. Then the second part is the trust instrument, which says this is the trust that arises out of the settlement. But where a settlement is being made by will, the testator is the trust instrument, and the executors have a vesting assent in favour of the tenant for life. So in that way, the legal estate was separated from the beneficial interest. Of course, the trustees have got the legal estate, and the beneficial interests are the ones who are actually benefiting from it. It's in their favour. So this has always been the case with trust for sale. But if there was no vesting deed executed, the tenant for life or the statutory owner could demand that the trustee of the settlement execute one. That's as per the Settled Land Act 1925, section 9.2. And until this was done, no disposition of land inter vivos, as in among the living, could operate to pass a legal estate unless it had been made for the purchaser, without notice of the fact that the tenant for life or the statutory owner had become entitled to a vesting deed made in his or her favour. So that's section 13 of the Settled Land Act 1925, the paralysing section. We call it that because it was intended to stop people getting around the Act by making it virtually impossible to dispose of legal estate. Let me come to an example of this. The SLA machinery, 1925. Supposing in 1950 a land is settled by will on Arabella for life, then to Belinda for life, and the remainder to Charlotte in fee simple. The will is a trust instrument, and the executors have to act out a vesting assent in favour of Arabella. Arabella holds the legal estate on trust for herself for life, then for Belinda, then for Charlotte. But after 1925, the life interest and the future interests were, of course, equitable. So when Arabella dies, the settlement would continue. The legal estate would vest in Arabella's special personal representatives, that's the trustees of the settlement, and Belinda could demand that they vest the legal estate in her. And then she would then hold it for herself, and then in trust for Charlotte, who came after her. But if Belinda died, the settlement was over. The legal estate would go back to Belinda's personal representative, and they had to give it by ordinary assent to Charlotte, who'd be the absolute owner. Okay, so later on I'll look at the tenant for life situation. Toodaloo.